Welcome to this week's discussion of the article that went out Friday. This is the third in a series entitled The Coming of Messiah, and we're concentrating on Yeshua's, in this article, we're concentrating on Yeshua's prophecy in Matthew 24. And this is the first part of that prophecy in Matthew. And we're going to do some free ranging here today. And with me to do that is my friend and brother, JP. JP, why don't you say hi and start us off here?
Well, good day, everybody, and good day to you, Harold. So the article, yeah, I read that, and in the article, you go pretty much directly to the last part of, well, let me refrain, the last part of the first part, since this is a two-part series, as you said, dealing with Yeshua's prophecy in Matthew 24. So verse 1 to 31 is the first part, and 1 to 30 is the first part, 31 to 51 is the second part. In the article, you deal a lot of the latter part, and I wanted to discuss a bit of the beginning of what Yeshua said. So first of all, one of the first things I sort of noticed in the article is you were talking about in the scripture, it says that the disciples asked to explain about the end of the age. And the end of the age is different than the end of the world. Could you explain that a bit?
There are different ages. Different eras and a couple of ages detailed in the Tanakh, which has been renamed the Old Testament. The first was the creation of Adam, or rather the fashioning of Adam in the garden as the first Hebrew. The second would be the flood with Noah. And the third would be the destruction of the temple. And when Yeshua is speaking to the Talmudim disciples in these first few verses of Matthew 24, he is distinctly speaking about the temple. It says that when he left the temple, some of the Talmudim approached him asking about the end of an age, and he turns around and points to these buildings, and he says that there will not be one stone left upon another, talking about the buildings of the temple. And that prophecy literally came to pass when the commander of the Roman legion that invaded Israel to put down a rebellion, the temple was burned, and all the gold that had adorned Solomon's temple melted, and it ran down into the crevices of the floor. And the commander gave his legion soldiers permission to go and gather all that gold that they possibly could. And so they went in there and literally unearthed all the stones of the flooring and the walls where the gold had run down. And so that prophecy came to pass, because when they were finished, there was not one stone left upon another.
Right.
Which is the end of an age.
Which is the end of an age. So modern people are looking for another end of an age or another end of the world, as they say it, but it's not necessarily how we think it to be.
You know, I need to back up, because actually the end of the age was signified by the destruction of the temple, but it actually began on Shavuot, when the breath of life was breathed upon all of those disciples that were gathered there in the temple. Or you could say that it was brought to an end with the resurrection of Yeshua, which opened that portal for the breath of life to be breathed upon those disciples.
Right. Right. So once this conversation started and Yeshua started asking, because they said, tell us about the end of the age, the first warning that he told them was to be careful to not be deceived.
Correct.
Because many were going to come saying that they were the Messiah, or that they were the Christ, as it is often quoted in Scripture, but that many would come. So did that come to pass? Did a lot of people? Was that something that he was talking about that was going to happen, or that had already come, or had?
You need to understand that at this point in time, the word Christ, none of these Hebrews understood what that meant. In fact, when is it James or First John that says already there are many antichrists that have gone out into the world? Actually, the way that should be read is already there are many anti-messiahs that have gone out into the world. Because the moniker Christ had not yet been
Formalized, I guess, right?
Formalized, yeah. It began as an epitaph, not so pretty epitaph, against the members of the Jewish sect called the Way, the sect of Judaism called the Way. And that was some years down the road when it began first to be used in that. I think the scripture said it was first used at Corinth as an epitaph against the members of the Way. And as it began to be picked up as a slang negative word, it was eventually embraced by those members of the Way who were non-ethnic Hebrews that had come into this pathway, seeking truth. But what happened is that the Roman Empire hated Jews, just hated them, and persecuted them just brutally. So these non-ethnic Hebrews began to petition Rome, and this was over a period of many decades, to treat them with some leniency, because, you know, they said, hey, we're not ethnic Hebrews. And after a while, particularly when the Roman Emperor Constantine came into power, he was looking for a religion that would help to unite all of these different parts of the world that the Roman Empire had conquered, and each one of them had a different god and worshiped differently. And he was looking for a religion that would unify all of these different regions. And that's when this new religion of Christianity caught his ear, and he convened a convention on the Greek island of, help me here.
I'm not sure. Not Patmos.
No, where that convention was convened in 325.
Oh my goodness. I'm drawing a blank too.
Anyway, and he gave them some strict edicts upon which this new religion would be founded, and they were, you know, it was to have nothing to do with anything Hebraic. And if anyone was caught worshiping on a Saturday, they were excommunicated. If anybody refused to eat pork, they were thrown out. If anybody was caught worshiping any of the participating in any of the feasts, they were thrown aside. It was a very distinct, because of their hatred for these Hebrews. He wanted to make sure that there was nothing Hebraic in this new religion of Christianity. Nicaea, it was in the Greek city of Nicaea. And
so did any Hebrews follow this at all? Like, did anybody well, we may not know that, but did anybody in this culture follow the Roman Catholic Church, or?
Well, if they were Hebrew, they were automatically excluded.
Okay.
And it became known as the Hello-Roman Catholic Church. Catholic means universal. So it was the Universal Church of Rome. And where Rome had persecuted these Hebrews, the Catholic Church took up that banner and far exceeded anything Rome had done.
So in his warning, as we go down, Yeshua said that many were going to come in my name, or as claiming to be messiahs, if you want to call it that, because I'm assuming by talking to his disciples, he recognized that not everybody recognized him as the Messiah. So I'm assuming that that was the warning. He was warning them that these messiahs could lead them astray.
Correct.
And but then it's the thing about wars and rumors of wars. So again, was that directed directly to the destruction of the temple, or was that?
Absolutely. The destruction of the temple didn't happen overnight. What had happened was that the Hebrews were revolting against this occupation of Israel by a Roman legion. And they did something nobody else had been able to do. They defeated that Roman legion in a war. And of course, Rome wasn't going to let that stand. And so they just sent a bigger legion. They just sent more troops. And the destruction of the temple was preceded by a siege. And that siege lasted for, by anybody's account, I think it lasted for more than a year, maybe two. So it was not something that was just, bam, bam, bam. And so when Yeshua said there will be wars and rumors of wars, he was talking about, the war that expelled Rome for a time, short period of time, and then a bigger war that took place thereafter.
So then he continues and says, to not be alarmed, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, earthquakes in various places, and all these things are but the beginning of birth pains. So again, is he talking about, because Christianity has really overlapped it for now. They're talking that these things, when you hear rumors of wars and all these earthquakes and famines, which is going on around the world right now, for them, this is what we're living. Was he talking then, or was he talking now?
He was talking then. You need to remember, first of all, that there is no precedent set anywhere in Scripture for this dual laying of prophecy. That is, prophecy that's given to a particular people in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular era, and comes to pass. But then there's this dual layering thought that it's also projected 2,000 years into the future to a generation of Gentiles who have no conception of what is taking place in this Hebrew world. The second thing we need to remember is that all of these Hebrews, every word of every book in what we call the Bible, was written by Hebrews, influenced out of a Hebrew culture that produced a unique Hebrew perspective and was primarily addressed to a Hebrew audience. And when it speaks about nation shall rise against nation, Rome, the nation of Rome, rose against the nation of Israel. And before that, we had encounters taking place between the northern and southern kingdom. No, I'm getting my time mixed up. But there were nations that were these two nations were fighting it out.
Okay. So he was specifically, so then it says, then they'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by nations for my name's sake. So if you look at his disciples, that's pretty much what happened, right?
Well, not only the disciples, but if you remember, again, his prophecy is directed toward the destruction of the temple. And when Rome defeated Israel, not only did they destroy the temple, but they banned every Hebrew from residing in or returning in any fashion to Israel. So they were dispersed into all these other nations that also had a disdain for Hebrews.
They really didn't have a good go of anything, did they?
I'm telling you, it was the only thing that I've been able to even try to make an illustration of for us in this time would be if a nuclear bomb dropped on Washington, D.C., and whatever invading force that was banned all Americans from coming back to America. I mean, that would be a pretty devastating, upsetting, life-changing event in all of our lives.
And on top of that, everywhere they landed, they almost got the same treatment everywhere they ended up.
That's what I'm saying, because they were dispersed to all of these other nations, and those nations already had a bias toward them that was acted out in the same way as Rome. I mean, they saw Rome treating these Hebrews that way, and it kind of gave them license to go ahead and do the same thing.
So then it continues and says that many are going to fall away, many are going to be betrayed by one another, hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. So again, if you're looking at just at that point in time, that's not in scripture anywhere. We don't have any recollection or any information about prophets if it was happening right then and there.
Well, Yeshua said in another place that there will be many who will claim to be the Messiah and will say, look here or go there. Or,
right. Yeah.
And he said, don't be deceived.
Right.
So he wouldn't be saying that if that wasn't already happening in his lifetime.
Yeah, there were other people claiming to be the Messiah back then.
Exactly.
There were other guys walking around, apparently displaying some healing powers and all these kinds of things. And
there were other prophets, and their message was be calm, don't worry, the Father has your back, everything is going to be cool, hunky-dory, just stay the course. I mean, there's all kinds of euphemisms that they were using even back then.
Right. Then he talks about lawlessness.
And part of the reason why Yeshua was deemed despicable to Judaism was because he was the only one of all these prophets that was giving a warning that this is going to come.
Right. go a little further down, and then he talks about the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel. What meaning would that, the abomination of desolation? That, I'm assuming that's been discussed a lot over the years as to what it means or what it doesn't mean, or because now most people think that a third temple is going to get built, or that's the prophecy according to what a lot of Christians think. So what would that have to do, standing in the holy place? What do you think that would have to do with what the message that he was trying to pass along?
Well, I think there's a reference in the article to a couple of Roman emperors who had put a statue of them in the temple. This wasn't the first time that Rome was, that Israel was overrun by Rome. And after was it Darius was the commander? Anyway, he was the son of the Roman emperor at that time, and if he didn't, I believe that emperor made a statue of himself, because these emperors were considered gods by this time.
Right. So between Yeshua's death and between the destruction of the temple, these emperors would have, or these whatever their titles were, would have made statues of themselves near or in the temple. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you mean?
Well, it would be after the destruction of the temple.
After. Okay.
I mean, in this particular prophecy that he's speaking about.
Right. So then he goes on to say, let no one, so basically he says to flee, pray that it's not in the winter time.
Or on a Shabbat.
Yeah. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that their flight may not be in winter on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. What is that? Is that time reference, or is that
we have to remember, and I have an article on this called Becoming Human. From a Hebrew perspective, someone did not become a human being until they had come into the kingdom of Yahweh by keeping his words. So, as I've pointed out before, in Scripture, there are only two categories of people. They're Hebrews, those who occupy the kingdom of Yahweh, and others. These others are usually called Gentiles, and they're people that worship gods other than Yahweh, which would preclude them from the kingdom. So when it speaks about, read that last part of that verse again, where no human being will be.
So it says, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Okay,
well, and we know that the elect are those who embrace Yeshua as that Messiah. You have a remnant of people that have been set aside from the world for Yahweh's purposes throughout the Tanakh. And these are those who keep the 10 words, but they haven't had a chance to embrace Yeshua as yet. And we still have some of those people as a remnant of this Hebrew people who do that today. And they are the ones that the promises will have been made by Yahweh, that he won't leave them destitute. He won't leave them abandoned. And I have another article entitled The Covering that explains that we, the elect, those who embrace Yeshua as the Messiah, are a covering over those who have not yet, who have received Yahweh by keeping his words, but have not yet received Yeshua as that Messiah. And there will come a day when the wedding, when there will be the wedding feast of the Messiah and the bride. Yeshua is referred to by John the Immerser in the first of Matthew as the bridegroom. You can't be the bridegroom and the bride at the same time, although Christianity somehow has made that okay. But the bride is this remnant of Hebrews that occupy the kingdom by keeping the Father's 10 words, who on that day will become joined with the bridegroom and become one flesh with him, just as we are today.
Okay. Clear as mud.
I have an article again that explains who the bride is.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not Christianity.
Right. Right. Then in his warning, he goes back and says how important it is to not follow the false Christs or the false messiahs, and to not follow the false prophets. So obviously, that must be a very important message, because he sort of repeats it. A few scriptures earlier, he said, don't go. And then he mentions it again, that if anyone says, look here, this is the Messiah, look, don't believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will arise, perform great signs and wonders, if possible, lead the very elect astray. See, I've told you beforehand, so that if you look in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Whenever the corpse is there, the vultures will gather. That's the scripture. In your article,
Go ahead.
Well, in the article, you mentioned that about the vulture. And you mentioned about the eagle.
The vulture, the Greek word for eagle is, I've got it there in the article.
Yeah, I wrote eagle down, but I didn't write the word.
Arios or something like that.
Right.
And that's the Greek word that's there in that passage that has been translated into vulture. And the reason that they changed it to vulture is because eagles don't feast on carrion, on dead carcasses. But the eagle was also the insignia worn by the Roman legions. They had banners, and on the top of that banner, they had this eagle. It was a common reference to a Roman legion in their day. And so when it talks about, read that last verse again, the dead, the eagle.
Yeah. So it says, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather.
Okay, the corpse then is the destruction of the temple. And the Roman legions were gathered there. And the first part of that, which says that the Son of Man will come like lightning, what is spirit? Yeshua is shortly after this becomes spirit with the Father. And spirit is the most brilliant, most intense, most pure light that you can imagine. And so when it speaks of the lightning shall be seen from the east to the west, it means the light of Yahweh as manifested in the life of Yeshua will be seen, and that's us. We are the keepers of the light, if for now, because his throne on Shavuot, his throne moved from the heavenlies into the hearts of those who would receive him for who Yahweh says he is. And then his words are now written on our hearts instead of on tablets of stone.
So the residence changed.
The residence changed, but the light moved with it because he is light. 1 John 1:5 says, Yahweh is light. And so that's us. Our task is to manifest that light in this earthly realm the way in which Yeshua exampled. And so when the saints come to an understanding of who they are and why they were placed here, all throughout this Hebrew culture, we see that the Father waits upon the behavior of men before he moves. And he's waiting on his saints to come into an actual realization of who they are in him, so that as one body, we can manifest that light in this earthly realm, just as Yeshua exampled.
So interestingly enough, the next little part is just about that. It's about the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's a pretty big statement.
Well, you have to remember that throughout Scripture, and that includes the Messianic writings, that there is a thing called figurative imagery that runs throughout the Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. And Yeshua used it most prominently in his parables. And here, again, it's another piece of figurative imagery where it talks about the stars. Stars throughout the Tanakh, stars uh, are an illustration of Hebrew people. If you remember when Yahweh spoke to Abraham, the promise he said was that your seed will be as the stars in heaven. He was talking about those people who would receive him and Yeshua as that Messiah. And there will come, in another place he says there will come a falling away from the faith. Well, in order to have a falling away from the faith, you first have to be in the faith. And so that's just another reference that he's given here about the stars falling from heaven. And the light. First, he prefaces all of this by saying there will be great tribulation. And that light will arise in the middle of this tribulation, but also the falling away from those of the faith. And actually, I think the falling away occurs before the.
Well, interestingly here, because he mentions it at the beginning, right? He mentions it at the beginning of chapter 24. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by nations, and then many will fall away. He says it, that's in verse 10 of chapter 24. So as I'm going through this, as we're going through this right now, I'm realizing that he just repeated himself
in a different way. In this figurative imagery that these Hebrews understood. I mean, this was part of their vocabulary, if you will.
They knew the stories, because if you look at the sun will be darkened and the moon won't give its light, that's directly quoted in Joel chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you are.
So he took that right there, and then said, then the stars and the powers of heaven will be shaken. What does that mean? What do you think? What do you think that?
When the scripture in Isaiah says that heaven is Yahweh's throne, earth is his footstool. But Yeshua quoted that verse as well. So in Shavuot, there was an epochal event that took place with this breath of life being breathed upon all of those who were waiting on him that day. In that his throne, you mentioned it earlier, Yahweh changed his residency from the heavenlies to within. And when Yahweh moved, his throne moved with him. And heaven is Yahweh's throne, so heaven moved with him. Heaven is not some fairy tale place over the clouds. Heaven is a state of being that we occupy because Yahweh's throne is now within us. So when it says that there will be a shaking in the heavens, there's a shaking will be going on inside of us, or that not will be inside of us. That shaking took place among those of the way. There were 70 years between the resurrection and the destruction of that temple. And so leading up to that, there will be this great shaking within those who were living in that time, and who, I'm sure, watching all of the events that took place, their faith was shaken.
Right, right. Because if he's talking strictly about the destruction of the temple, then is it 70 years after he was crucified or 40 years after
It was 70 years after the resurrection.
the resurrection? So when he's talking about this tribulation and the destruction of the temple, it was 7 years between what he talked about and then. So all these false messiahs and false Christs and prophets.
The persecution of Rome, them being defeated and then coming back, I mean, before they were defeated, like I said earlier, they despised Hebrews. They didn't figure them to be any more than cockroaches, something that needed to be stepped on. And for those Gentiles who were becoming part of the way, Rome didn't make a distinction between who was ethnic and non-ethnic. They just were all Hebrew, and they were all just vermin to be destroyed.
Or to be slaves.
Slaves or crucified. I mean, crucifixion during this time was a widely used manner of death by the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now again, you read this, it's imagery, it's Son of Man coming on the clouds and all this kind of stuff.
Well, the clouds throughout Scripture, it speaks of clouds of witnesses. So when you've got a cloud of witnesses, Yeshua is coming in that cloud. He's coming in those people of the way who were receiving him. Like, again, you gotta read this stuff from the perspective of these Hebrews that were writing it down. They had no conception of Christianity. They had no conception of any of these theologies that so permeate our culture today. They were invested in and involved in the culture of their time.
But when you read that scripture, coming in the clouds of the heaven with the power and great glory, that's almost a direct quote from Daniel chapter 7.
It is.
And they will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Daniel 7, 29 and 30.
Now, in the depiction of what Christianity calls the ascension, where Yeshua flies up beyond the clouds, the angel says, as you have seen him leave, he will return in the same manner. Well, again, if we're understanding clouds to be witnesses, he didn't. I did a study on this in an article. And if you go back to the original Greek words that are translated as the English up, there's like 5 or 6 different Greek words that are translated as the English up. But interestingly, none of those Greek words have any directional connotation to them.
Right.
So
you mentioned in your article, lifted up, gazing up, taken up, caught up. None of them have direction.
None of them have any directional connotation in the Greek words. So if you then again, looking at that through the uh, uh, perspective of the Hebrews, he stepped out of one dimension into another. I don't like to use that illustration because everybody thinks about beam me up, Scotty, but that's not what I'm talking about. He stepped out of one dimension into those disciples. They were the precursor of all that was to come on Shavuot. They were the precursor for receiving the breath of life when the first thing he did when he was resurrected, he appeared to the disciples and he breathed on them and he said, receive the breath of life. And in this particular situation, he was dispersed among the disciples within the disciples, again, them being a precursor of what was to come on Shavuot. The disciples always had ringside seats to whatever he did. And so it would be natural that he would continue that by allowing them to experience what was to come. And in the chapter, it's in John 20, but I think where this particular verse comes from is from another description of that in Luke. And at the bottom of that chapter, it says, and he gave them understanding of all that he had spoken of in the scriptures. He opened their understanding to the scriptures that he had been trying to show them that was coming to pass in front of their eyes.
I just want to, we've got a few minutes left here. I just want to go over the words about the up, because I hero, and it means to exalt, or poro, which means to lead over, carry over, or to deport. So it's not really, I guess some people could say that as a directional thing, but the apero, to exalt, is definitely not directional. Gazing up means to turn one's eye, so I can see where they can get the direction from that, but really it's not really the turning, it's more about the vision. You've got taken up, which means to carry. Again, that's an action. I mean, if you're carrying something, you're going to go somewhere, but it's and then caught up, to seize. Caught up to seize. Yes. Harpazo. And that's another phrase that has been used by Christianity, the famous caught up in the clouds, right? In I think it's 1 Thessalonians 4, where they get this rapture ideology from. So if you look at this, it's to seize. It's not to go anywhere. It's just to
capture, to seize,
to capture. So that was another very interesting I guess side note, because we've discussed the famous rapture ideology in the past. And again, so if you look at what did you say that clouds meant again? Because again, right, if you're caught up in the cloud of
witnesses,
right.
and those disciples, that they were witnessing this event where he stepped out of one realm into another.
So the article was about prophecy that all happened. It's all done. So this is 3 articles now that we've gone through. We've gone to the prophecy of Daniel. We've gone through Ezekiel's temple, which was the second. And now we're going through this first part, explaining this whole prophetic, what's the word that I'm looking for? Well, the end times, prophetic end times. And as we go through this, we're recognizing that it's already all happened. It's not a future event. It's all it's pretty straightforward that it's all already happened.
It's all already happened. And the reason that again, the reason that Yeshua was pointing toward the temple, as was Daniel and Ezekiel, was that I mean, it totally decimated every Hebrew's life at that time. It just totally. And I mean, if that's not an apocalypse, I don't know what is.
Right. Right. So then, quick question. Do you think the book of Revelation has also already happened?
I do. And the final article of this series is entitled Armageddon, and it explains why, gives evidence as to why the book of Revelation was speaking about the destruction of the temple.
Wow. So, to be continued.
Well, again, I would like to encourage you to not just go by this discussion, read the article, because we've just skipped across the surface of it, and there's just so much more meat in the article. And follow the links that will give you supporting verses and other outside scripture that also supports these things, and see for yourself if what we are saying here is not scriptural. Now, if you find it in scripture and you don't understand it, don't throw it away. Hang it on a hook, put it on the shelf, and wait and ask the Father to give you understanding, and He will. That's part of His promise to us. And so, until the next time,
Shalom.
shalom, shalom.